I've been playing Cyberpunk 2077 pretty much maxed out at 4K. I'm going to show you guys the build that I'm using as well as my different settings where I get the best visuals and performance. Let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago here. So Cyberpunk 2077 is a really exciting game. I know there's been a lot of hoopla on the internet with some performance issues and some things popping up, but it is a massive game and I think it's one of the best showcases of the new technology that we have available to us with these new RTX GPUs. I'm going to be showing you guys not only the settings that I've been using to play with a 4K 144Hz HDR monitor, but I'm also going to show you the build that I'm using. And this build is going to be using an RTX 3090 as well as a 10900K just to make it a little bit different than the other AMD builds that we've been doing. I'm also going to do a separate video with an AMD 5950X and a 3090 using it on ultra-wide, so be sure to check that video out as well. I'm going to do the same thing, show you guys the build and the settings. So first, let's talk about the actual settings that I've been using. I'm going to show you guys a quick little video that I did, a real-time video where I'm using the system that's right behind me, and yes, it blows a lot of hot air because of that 3090. I'm going to show you the settings that I used as well as some graphical changes, and right after that I'm going to show you guys the build that I'm using. So playing Cyberpunk, this is an EVGA 3090 for the Win 3 Ultra. That's an Apex motherboard with a 10900K. Some nice RAM over there. This is the bequiet, the 500DX case. We have a Corsair AIO 360mm, the Capellix, the new one. So this is the 4K 144Hz monitor. Basically, let me show you guys my settings that I'm running it at. We'll go into settings. So I put it Ray Tracing Ultra. I kept everything pretty much the same. And for DLSS, I put on auto. So basically what it's gonna do, I think it's gonna try to keep me around 60 frames per second. And you can see the GPU's around 66C, 67. We got around 57, 56 FPS. You know, as the game sort of plays. And of course, I guess as you move around, you know, the FPS is going to change a little bit. Let's see if we walk around outside. You know, the FPS definitely drops to around 50. GPU goes up a little bit. The 10900K seems to be doing pretty well with it. So this is with pretty much some of the higher settings you can get. Let's see what happens if we go to settings and we raise it even a little more. There's a little wiggle room here. Let me show you. So instead of ultra, we can do psycho, and the ray tracing instead of ultra, we do psycho, and then instead of auto, we're gonna go to quality. That's gonna give us the best visual. Now it's gonna drop that frames per second. Let's see how far it's gonna drop it. Ooh, 32, you see that? I dropped it like in half. So this is at 4K. With a 3090. This is like basically the highest you can put, you know, without doing like super resolution or something like that. So you can see you're getting around 30 frames per second at 4K. And this is everything ultra and psycho for those two, you know, different settings. And DLSS is going to be set, of course, to quality. So while, I mean, it looks really incredible, it's definitely a big performance hit. So let's see how good DLSS is if we put it on auto. And let's see what it's going to try to do. We'll leave everything else psycho. And we're going to put this auto. Let's see what happens. Let's move around a little bit. So you see, that shoots it way back up over 50. Much more playable now. And remember, ray tracing is still on psycho. We have the other mode on psycho as well. But DLSS is now on auto, so it's doing its, you know, AI magic. And it's not 60 frames per second, but it's pretty high. At least it's not 30. Yeah, very playable. It looks very good. And of course, if we do a couple more realistic settings, like instead of custom, let's just say we keep that on ultra and that on auto without the psycho. Basically, you know, we get a lot closer to 60 frames per second. And honestly, it's hard to tell a difference really. Like it still plays really, really well. I don't see too much of a difference. Game looks great. And you know, it's gonna vary a little bit, but it does get closer to 60 like this without having the cycle modes. This is just a very busy area, a lot of people. So this probably is gonna stress a lot more. And you can see that GPU is definitely running pretty hard. 10900K, but it seems to be managing it well. That's a 3080. We're not using that right now with an EK AIO. That's just my workstation. This is the gaming one. So overall, I'd say DLSS and ray tracing definitely very playable and impressive. And if I wanted to hit 144 Hz, of course I could just turn ray tracing down, maybe turn other settings down, and you could easily hit it with a 3090. This is really maxed out settings. Even though this is on a 4K monitor capable of 144 Hz, we're getting around 60 frames per second when we have these optimized settings. With ray tracing really pretty much maxed out, DLSS really helps the performance. You can max out pretty much all the graphical settings, and it seems like it's very smart and intuitive, where it's actually doing a pretty good job. Of course, these type of technologies always develop with drivers and with time, so it's not going to be perfect, but my opinion from playing this game, everything's super fast. Like the menus open really quickly. When you change settings, you don't have to restart the game. So there are actually a lot of nice little optimizations that are already included in the game. I know people have had complaints with little bugs and glitches, but so far my gaming experience has certainly been very great. And I think this is probably the best example of what ray tracing together with DLSS can do. It definitely makes for a really great experience. If DLSS was off, of course you would get much more of a performance penalty, but having the combo of both, the visuals look stunning and the frames per second certainly seem to stay very respectable. So Cyberpunk 2077 certainly does seem to be taking advantage of these new technologies. So let's talk about the build. Now, the case that I chose for this build is going to be the bequiet 500DX. I think it's super compact and you can still fit all this pretty awesome hardware in it. So I put in, of course, the EVGA for the 133090. Now, the Founders Edition actually seems to run a little quieter and cooler than this GPU. That's because, first of all, the Founders Edition cooler is massive by itself, the 3090, and it has a cool pass-through design, but this EVGA GPU is also putting out a lot more power. In fact, you can put a custom BIOS on it to give you 500 watts, so it's certainly going to run hotter just because it's going to be outperforming it to some degree. But even having said that, I paired it with this Apex Z490 motherboard, a very overclocking friendly motherboard, and of course with the 10900K. I wanted to see how the 10900K would perform at 4K, if there'd be any difference between this and one of the Ryzen chips. I know there have been a couple of things in the news lately about Ryzen and not being fully optimized for Cyberpunk 2077, but I think with the latest patch they did address some of those issues. And also cooling the CPU, I'm using Corsair's new 150i, the Elite Capellix RGB. It does a pretty good job. It seems like during stress tests it stays around the 70C range, even lower during gaming as you saw in the video with Cyberpunk 2077, and it's pretty quiet. You can definitely do a lot of custom settings with the fan curves and with the pump, giving you pretty quiet operation. And I do like the way the RGB looks. You can sort of see it from the front. I wanted to make this build nice and straightforward without too much crazy things going on, because the focus really here is to jam a lot of performance in a fairly small case. And then one of the more interesting components that I actually put in here, this is going to be the Silverstone 1650 watt power supply. Silverstone sent me this power supply to use in a build and see how it is, and I thought what better place to put it than with an overclocked 10900K and a 3090, especially the EVGA for the 13, which goes up to around 500 watts. Now, of course, these components are not enough to get near that 1650 watt rating, but I did test SLI 3090 from EVGA, the for the 13, and with a powerful CPU as well. I was seeing numbers on the power meter well over 1200 watts when running something like 3D Mark and really stressing everything. So having said that, we have to remember as well that these RTX 3000 GPUs, even if they say a certain rating or a certain minimum, they do have different little spikes of power where they seem to spike really high. If you don't have a high quality power supply that has sufficient watts, you could be tripping your components. Even if technically it's not going over the watts, it's possible once in a while due to those power spikes you may have those issues. I always like having something that's overkill, especially for the power supply, because that's really running all of your components, and with a lot of headroom like that, you don't have to worry about your components, and typically it just makes for a better user experience, and the fans won't have to spin up nearly as high with these power supplies because you're basically not going to get near that power limit unless you're doing a lot of crazy different things. So in order to reach that almost 650 watt, I don't really think you can do it with gaming. The most I was able to do with regular gaming, if you're doing SLI and benchmarking, was around 1200 to 1300 watt range, but it's nice having that 300 watt of headroom because like I mentioned before, especially if you're doing overclock overclocking, you can easily spike these GPUs and affect your power supply. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed the build as well as the look at some of these Cyberpunk settings. Hopefully it's useful. Let me know what type of performance you're getting below, as well as the build that you're using. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.